All right. Okay, well, welcome back everybody to the afternoon session of our workshop. And it's my very great pleasure to welcome Professor Mary Lovely, who is going to speak to us or share with us her thoughts on the future of trade in the Asia Pacific region. Professor Lovely is a senior fellow at the Peterson Institute for International Economics and also Professor of Economics at the Melvin A. Eggers Faculty and the Melvin A. Eggers Faculty Scholar at Syracuse University's Maxwell School of Citizenship and Public Affairs, where she combines interests in international economics and China's development. During 2011 to 2015, she served as co-editor of the China Economic Review. Her research projects have included investigating the effects of China's foreign direct investment policies on trade flow and entry mode, the relationship between proximity to export markets and cross-city wage variation, and the influence of Chinese tariff reductions on labour shares of value in its manufacturing firms. She has completed studies of American manufacturing employment and outsourcing to low-income countries, the role of intellectual returnees in the success of China's photovoltaic solar industry, and the structure of Chinese reforms of stated enterprises, a hot topic these days. Professor Lovely earned a PhD in economics at the University of Michigan, Ann Arbor, one of the centers of international economic expertise, I guess, in the United States, and a master's degree in city and regional planning from Harvard University. I would add that at the Peterson Institute, she's become a leading commentator on the ups and downs of US trade policy, including through the turbulent years of the recent trade wars, as well as on global economic policy in the pandemic age. One of the go-to sources, I think, for comment coming out of the US on those issues. And perhaps of particular interest to us in our part of the world, earlier this year, in the opening weeks of the Biden administration, she testified to the US Congress on the future of US-China relations. Professor Lovely, we're really looking forward to hearing what you have to say, and I'll turn the floor over to you.
Great. Thanks so much, Rob. Okay. I would like to share my screen, and I will do so now. It's a real pleasure to be with you tonight. I think we should have more discussion of Asia-Pacific relations and how they're intersecting with the US-China trade war. In the US, we tend to be myopic. We tend to talk about things in a vacuum. I have to say there's also, I think, for the majority of Americans, very little exposure to news from around the world. Maybe some people will find that surprising, but like all local areas, what happens locally seems most important. But being here in Washington, that has changed. We, of course, are focused on Asia right now, particularly since this week, President Biden and President Xi had a virtual meeting on Monday night, and the readout came yesterday. So we are having some news from the Asia Pacific region that is being dissected as we speak here in DC tonight. So I hope to provoke some conversation, some thought from all of you. I will probably irritate someone on some slide or everyone on one slide or another, hopefully not all on the same slide. And that's okay. I think we need to move out of our comfort zone, think about new ideas, think honestly about what's happening in the world. Ambassador Alan Wolf, fresh from his stint at the World Trade Organization, is now visiting with us at the Peterson Institute. And he gave a speech, I believe yesterday, speaking about the need for a kind of a big bang, a big thinking at the World Trade Organization. And I think if Alan can think big for the WTO, we need to think big as well for all aspects of the US trade relationship and its implications for the rest of the world. So let me start my slides. The title is US-China Relations, Implications for the World Trading System. But of course, this could be not just a book length, it could be multi-volume, right? So I'm just gonna raise some issues, as I said, and hopefully we can generate some conversation. So first, I want to offer my congratulations from the Peterson Institute of International Economics to our friends in New Zealand on your successful leadership of APEC 2021. This is a tough time to be leading APEC, and you know, the grace with which you did it, I think, is to be commended. Now, at APEC 2021, the leaders agreed to a number of things, and taking it from the APEC 21 website, I think this might be the official source. We see that the leaders agreed to reject vaccine nationalism, lower tariffs on vaccines and related products, speed them through customs, and avoid export bans. Maybe we've gone a little jaded, but this is very important. At the start of the pandemic, we didn't know how nations would resolve. And of course, we saw some movements toward this, and we're still far away from where we want to be in terms of providing the vaccine for everyone. The leaders also agreed to digitize trade processes, to transition away from carbon, to highlight indigenous economies, and to find ways to cut red tape, reduce the cost of business, and making it faster to start a business. All important things to agree to. But I think that if we're honest with ourselves, while we admit that in the current environment, these are real achievements, they're not really enough. They're not going to get us to where we really need to be in terms of reviving the international trading system. I think we know that the WTO is in crisis. It may be a slow-moving crisis. I know that Dr. Ngozi, whom I admire very much, is doing everything she can to pull the institution out of this crisis, but it is in crisis. The US and China cannot find a way to reduce trade and technology tensions, again, despite at least some movement in that direction, particularly with the bilateral meeting on Monday. And yet, while these tensions are rising, China's share of exports and global foreign investment hit new highs in 2020. China weaponizes trade policy, and it seems unlikely to engage on issues of importance to the West, particularly non-market practices, at least as seen by the West. The US also weaponizes trade policy and seems unlikely to engage on issues of importance to Asia, especially further liberalization. So the question we need to address is polarization a more likely outcome than further integration in the Asia-Pacific region? And what can we do to try to pull away from what we might see as increasing polarization or the dividing of the trading world into two spheres? Confidence in the WTO to mediate trade tensions is on the line at the MC12, which is coming up soon, the ministerial conference. It seems to outsiders that the WTO can't get anything done and can't get anything resolved. Yet, as Dr. Ngozi reminds us, it remains the guide for world trade, and world trade recovered quite nicely from the pandemic. Now, what has been happening while the WTO has, in some sense, been limping along, particularly because of the US refusal to help seat new judges on the appellate body? Well, in 2020, WTO members initiated 349 new anti-dumping investigations, 22 safeguard investigations, and 56 countervailing duty investigations. Those are not all new records, but some are. Many cases were brought by the same country, and many involved metals. This sounds similar to where I started my career 30 years ago or 20 years ago. So we have to ask, is it the same old, or is it possible to begin to make progress? Dr. Ngozi has made the WTO a force working to prevent trade barriers for vaccines, and I think she has been successful. And she's overseeing the day-to-day work of technical assistance, conducting trade policy reviews, and pushing forward negotiations. We have to remember that those are not trivial accomplishments. But the prospects reform remain bleak, and the appellate body remains dead. So we have to say these accomplishments, to some extent, may be overshadowed by our failure to be able to resolve differences. The prospect for completion of agreements already on the table is very much in doubt. And of course, all of us trade watchers are watching to see if new fisheries subsidies disciplines can be agreed to by MC12. So it leads to the question, can multilateralism endure when countries are pushing in different directions? And I'd like to highlight two here. One is countries that are seeking clubs, particularly climate clubs, and the US, which is now seeking not reshoring, but friendshoring. I don't know if this has reached the shores of New Zealand, but our Commerce Secretary, Gina Raimondo, has talked about friendshoring as opposed to reshoring, which really harkens back to something from the Trump administration, which was a trusted supplier network, really. So can multilateralism endure in this environment? The answer that the EU would give is yes. Clubs are open. Open clubs can push important agendas forward. Sabine Whelan, the EU's trade minister, would certainly argue that open clubs are important and can push the agenda forward and be compatible with multilateralism. And not every country is ready for the type of carbon commitments that the EU wants in its trading partners. Today, we heard about its deforestation commitments, or the high labor standards and human rights standards that the EU approach requires. Yet open agreements provide incentives for countries to prepare for and adopt the higher standards on environment and labor that the EU is seeking in its trade partners, and therefore opens a path to a increasingly encompassing club. On the other hand, the US approach is quite different. I have characterized it as, no, we don't want everyone in our club. And this is not all US policy, but there's an important strain of it that has this tenor. We want to do business only with trusted suppliers, and the trusted suppliers would be those that we decide are trusted. We want to align supply chains by trading with our friends. And these agreements may appear open. You could become trusted or you could become a friend, but they're actually closed, and that is a problem. Are the two Western views compatible? Before we turn to Asia, we might ask, one of President Biden's key policy initiatives has been to restore good relations with our allies, and has reached out repeatedly, particularly to the Europeans. Are the Europeans and the US offering different views? I have indicated that I think they are. Can we find that these two views are compatible? Well, let's take the view of the Europeans and open clubs. They have a carbon border adjustment mechanism coming. Can the US live with that? Can the US live with taxes on imports that have more carbon in them than the Europeans believe they produce by producing the same good? The answer is yes. I think the US can live with that. I think the US will be able to meet the standards. And so I don't see that moving forward as a very large impediment to the two sides. What about the deforestation test? Can the US live with that? I think also the US will live with that. Data privacy and data protections. Can the US live with that? There'll be tension over this, but I think in the end, the EU and the US will find a way forward. What about the EU's approach to the US example, closed clubs? Export controls on tech sales to China. Can the EU live with them? The EU has lived with them and has adjusted to them, although with some bumps along the road. I think the question for the Europeans is, how far will the Americans go? Are the Europeans okay with sanctions for human rights violations? I would say yes, the Europeans can live with them, even though they have pushed back against new sanctions on Iran when President Trump pulled the United States out of the agreement, which had been previously negotiated. But the EU can live with sanctions for human rights violations, and in fact has joined the United States in recent rounds of sanctions. Can the Europeans go along with removing China from supply chains if the US decides that Chinese producers are not part of their trusted or friendly network? I think here the US cannot, the European Union cannot live with this. Can live in some sense, to some extent, as we've seen in European pullback from Huawei and 5G. But largely, I think the Europeans are very wary of this. The EU and the US will be able to find some way forward on some issues, as in the reinvigorated trilateral meetings on industrial subsidies, which have also included Japan. but they will be unable to agree on China if the fundamental issue remains forming a closed club. Now, why will the EU and the US be unable to agree with how to engage with China? I think both share many views and concerns about China, centered on national security concerns and allegations of unfair commercial competition. The US policymakers have a litany of complaints against China, which usually goes like this: non-market practices through their state-owned enterprises, industrial subsidies, and unfair trade. That is pretty vague, but that's the litany. Those same complaints we can hear from members of the European Parliament, members of the German Parliament, but not to the same extent. So they share many views and concerns, but the degree to which they are willing to turn that into policy has been very different. We've seen that President Trump in particular went very far with his tariffs on China, and the EU did not follow his lead. Now, part of that can be explained by the fact that the Europeans did not experience a negative China shock, which is the US term used to explain what they see as an industrial hollowing out that was caused by China's entry into the world trading system. I myself think that this narrative is far overblown, but we have to admit that it has a great deal of political salience in this country. The Europeans didn't experience the same shock. They also have a stronger safety net, and so there are many parts of their economies, even those that were in decline, did not experience the same types of outcomes. And their domestic constituencies today do not demand the same level of trade rebalancing that we see in the United States. I think conditional on Chinese behavior, the EU would like to find a way to bring China into its climate club and continue their successful commercial integration in Asia. The US, however, is not open. When we're talking about things like friendshoring and trusted networks, it's pretty clear that we're not including China, even though the United States has not defined its so-called strategic competition with China very clearly. So in light of this, do we see the US going alone and decoupling from China? Well, we already know that Trump's China tariffs remain very high, about 20%, and broad. We have 20% tariffs on over 50% of our imports from China. Truly unprecedented. Some exemptions will be extended under the Biden administration, and some new exemptions will be granted. But what shape will these changes take? We really still don't know, despite Ambassador Tai, the US trade representative, announcing these exemptions. Will we see what National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan calls strategic tariffs? That is, tariffs that are pivoted away from the basket that President Trump targeted to perhaps goods that the US believes are unfairly subsidized by the Chinese. These are just questions. We really don't know what path this will take. How far will the desire to develop 5G networks, AI, or artificial intelligence standards and protocols, and adherence to high environmental and labor standards throughout its supply chains lead US policies to explicitly or implicitly cut out China? Again, today our Commerce Secretary talked about the need for the United States to develop AI standards in conjunction with countries who shared our values. Again, I believe that's a way of saying we want a closed club. Foreign invested enterprises operating in China provide more than half of US imports from China. That comes as a surprise to many people in the West. What does US decoupling mean for global supply chains then? Will US companies not be able to buy, for example, from a Foxconn factory in China or a Samsung factory? How will that affect our Asian allies? So will the US decouple or will it self-isolate, I think, is the ultimate question. It's important to remember, however, that President Biden is not President Trump. There is no intention to use trade policy as a weapon or as a method for retaliation, or as former US Trade Representative Ambassador Lighthizer said, as payback for what we think of as what he perceived to be years of unfair trade. I do think it could be used as punishment in some cases, as it has, as in the form of economic sanctions, or as a signal for an intent that the US government may have. Despite that, President Biden will work with allies, and I think the allies will moderate the US approach. As I mentioned before, I don't think the EU shares some of the same concerns, but not to the same extent that the US does. And in particular, I think they don't see the same kind of commercial competition that the US does. The Biden-Xi talks, which occurred on Monday evening here in the United States, despite no major breakthroughs, did have several good outcomes. And it's interesting that these are being downplayed here in the West. One was strategic reassurance between the two giant economies, very important. And initiation of talks on nuclear stability, also very important. Today we had an announcement of a thaw in the information freeze that the two countries will sign a media access agreement. Again, something is very important, since continued communication and information about each other's intent is very important to ensuring that misperceptions don't lead to bad outcomes. Finally, I'll just present these numbers, the only numbers in my talk tonight. Can the US decouple from China but not Asia? In my view, the answer is clearly no. And to some extent, US talk of decoupling is what economists call cheap talk, because the consequences of that have not been fully vetted or even, I think, admitted. Here we see export shares from the countries that are in the row to each of the columns. And here you can see I've put this first column mostly in yellow. These are exports, say, from the United States to the countries that are members of RCEP, the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership. You will see that for all of the countries or regions that are listed here, trade with RCEP forms the largest share of their export bundle. So the US, 25% almost of US exports go to RCEP. Of course, a bigger share go to the CPTPP countries, because that includes Canada and Mexico, with whom we, of course, share the USMCA and have very large trade flows. Japan, almost 46% of its exports go to RCEP countries. 37% for China, 54% for Korea, 23% for India. I think we see that trade with RCEP nations is very important to all of these countries: the United States, China, US allies like Japan and Korea. And so the idea that we would be able to decouple from China, but not from the other parts of the Asian production network, I think is really not very realistic. So where does that leave us? I think the road is rocky. You might ask, well, what then is US policy? The answer I have for you tonight is, frankly, we don't know yet. The United States, Biden administration, has not issued its so-called Asia policy. So we really don't know what the long-term economic strategy will be in the Asia Pacific as written by the United States. In the meantime, the world trading system will limp along, and that may be the best that we can expect. The EU will offer its open clubs, it already has, as an alternative to trading only with quote unquote friends. The US-China technique coupling, we'll continue to see that move along. And it has the potential to tear apart global value chains and establish trade relations across Asia that feed US markets and other markets. Perhaps I'm an optimist, but I think it will stop far short of that. The question is where? Can US policy contain enough guardrails that it doesn't fracture the global trading system? And will China agree to constraints on policies that are not consistent with its WTO obligations that will allow the WTO to be restored. China, to its credit, has become a more active partner in WTO, has put forward a number of issues, including support for ocean plastics, removal of ocean pollution, plastic pollution in the ocean, and other initiatives. Can the US also become a responsive partner again? I think that's the question we're left at. I wish I had a more optimistic ending, but I think we're at a very important point. Here in the United States with the Biden administration, we have a great deal of optimism, but it's tempered by the understanding that the politics in the United States are difficult. They constrain trade policy greatly. US-China competition constrains trade policy, and maybe we should be looking for smaller ways to move forward. So lower expectations, hopefully with better outcomes. Okay, I'm going to leave it there and hope that we can have some lively discussion of these ideas.
Thank you very much, Mary. You've certainly given us a huge amount to think about, and I'm sure there will be many more questions than we have time to probably cover in the time we have available. And I should say I omitted, for the benefit of other participants in the room, to make the announcement at the beginning of this session that if you have questions that you would like to put to Professor Lovely, if you would type them into the chat function and address them to me, and I will transmit them to Professor Lovely, and you will then be asked to actually verbally put your questions to her. So we'll do it that way. But in the meantime, while we're waiting for those questions to come in, perhaps Asher, if you have any questions you'd like to put to her, or I have a few questions that I could certainly raise in the meantime.
Okay, thanks, Rob. I can go first. So Mary, Vice President Harris indicated that the US would like to host APEC in 2023, I think. So I wanted to get your impression on what the thinking is in Washington around this. Is there excitement around it? Are there any goals that are being discussed?
You know, I don't really know what goals are being discussed within the administration because I'm, not in the White House, but I would say that APEC is a very diverse group of countries. And I think that it's not clear, at least to the American public, what it's for, what are we doing? So I think the administration will have a bit of a challenge to, if it wants to use this as a forum to really try to build political support for a strong Asia policy. And that will be the challenge for them moving forward. Hopefully, we will have something coming from the administration within the next few months. If obviously Vice President Harris, wants to host this, wants the United States to host this, and it seems like they view it as part of an agenda to focus attention on Asia. That will be after the midterm elections. So again, we really don't know where US Asia policy will be, but I do hope they use this as a way to build public support for the US to kind of get its head up and look across the ocean.
Thanks, Mary.
Thanks, Mary. One of the really mind-blowing things you said was this concept of friend sharing with supply chains with partners. And I just immediately started to think of what that would mean in terms of dismantling existing supply chains that have been built up over decades, let alone years, and what would be the reaction of US business to that? And on the other hand, what would be the trade policy measures that would be required to implement that policy? And what would that mean for the world trading system and the WTO and its rules? I just found that mind-boggling, to be quite honest. I wondered how you see it.
Yes, she used it a couple weeks ago in a speech at the Peterson Institute. She's repeated it since. Actually, she used it, I think, today in a speech around, I think, in Geneva for events with the WTO. But don't hold me to that. So it's left the shores. This idea, it has set sail. I think you're asking very good questions, Rob. I wish I had an answer. I think those of us who have studied supply chains are like, say what? How are you going to do that? You know, the Trump administration never, in my view, never seemed to have a plan for how it would put things back together. It was intent on just, in some sense, destroying relationships. And, you know, it came pretty close to doing that in a couple of cases. It certainly didn't help to win us a lot of friends. So, you know, we kind of got it that that was what they were about. And I think that US corporate interests largely kept their heads down. I see more interest now in the US business community to push back on this idea. So you asked, what is the business response? I think US businesses are beginning to see that this is a bad idea. They're willing to obviously make changes that are consistent with US national security. So businesses are keen to, you know, adhere to US law on things like export controls, investment screening. But beyond that, they really don't know where this is going, and they sense that it's not good for them. So we are beginning to see the business pushback that I frankly thought would have come in 2017. But it is coming. And I think there's this notion that some dose of reality has to hit these types of pronouncements. But so far, we've just had reshoring trade is morphed into friendshoring, as if somehow that will be enough, that we can have Japan, Korea, India in our supply chains and somehow cut out China, as if they haven't really seen how modern production takes place.
Well, it just so happens that we now have a question for you from New Zealand's Deputy Head of the APEC Business Advisory Council in New Zealand, Stephanie Honey. Stephanie, I'd invite you to put your question to Mary.
Thank you so much, and thank you very much, Professor Lovely. That was a really fascinating and informative presentation. I wondered if you would care to comment on this new closed club, I guess you could describe it as, that the US is also talking about, of a new Indo-Pacific economic framework. As I said, it seems to fit very neatly into your taxonomy of a closed club, but is it going to go anywhere? On a related note, how do you see the relationship with CPTPP now that we have China seeking to join? And then I guess the other sort of architectural thing that's happened lately is this new agreement with Japan, which says lots of great things about, I guess you could say, sort of aspects of modern economies like digital trade and so on, but doesn't really seem to do very much in terms of market opening. So how do you see all those different pieces fitting together? Thank you.
Wow, those are great questions, and thanks so much for being here tonight and for participating in this. The first question, I want to say, first of all, I am calling it a closed club. That's not the official, and you did not imply that it was, but I just want to be clear on that. I think it's disingenuous to keep talking about these things without admitting that this is not going to be within the, open WTO consistent framework, whereas the Europeans try very hard to ensure that what they're proposing will pass WTO muster. Your first question was about the new framework for the Asia Pacific region, right? And I read that, and the fact that the official US line is we're not going to join CPTPP. We're not going to have a traditional trade agreement, which is, anyone who knows anything about the CPTPP knows it was not just a traditional trade agreement. It was trade plus, brought in a lot of new things, right? Many of which were brought over, and then some of them enhanced for the US, the rewrite of NAFTA. So it really broke new ground. So I thought that was disingenuous. I do not see they're talking about Asia Pacific and enhancing the Asia-Pacific supply chains, the linkages, the global value chains which link us. But it's not going to be a trade agreement. It's not going to include the things that the CPTPP does, digital trade, logistics, right? We have constraints on state-owned enterprises in the CPTPP, labor standards. What is it that's going to be? What I tweeted about this morning, and I said, it's not CPTPP, it's not traditional trade, it's a bird, it's a plane. In my view, it's never going to happen because what is it? So these are the frustrations that we have here. We have an administration that we would like to see succeed. We particularly like the fact that the United States is serious about negotiating with other nations and enhancing our relationships and alliances. But increasingly, there seems like there's no there. So that is very frustrating. I think some of that carries over to the US-Japanese agreement. Lots of nice words. We know that the Japanese wanted very much for the US to come back into CPTPP. They're to be commended for continuing with the other countries to bring it to fruition. But market access has always been a big stickler between the US and Japan, particularly on things like agricultural products. And I don't see this administration really being able to break new ground there. So maybe we'll have some nice things come from that, but we'll see. I mean, I guess what I'm saying is we have the same old barriers that we had before, and a US that's unwilling to cede any market access. And this administration has not talked at all about increasing market access. It talks about a worker-centered trade policy over and over again, and I still really don't know what that means, but it does seem to mean that we will not be rolling back much of the protectionism that already exists, because that might cost somebody's job. So that's where we are. So I think there's been a lot of nice words, confusing words though, and words that in the end don't really add up to much, I'm afraid to say.
Okay, following on some of those themes, we have a question here from Professor Natasha Hamilton-Hart, who is the director of our New Zealand Asia Institute at the University of Auckland. Natasha.
Thank you, and thank you very much for that presentation. And I'd like to actually follow on from the last thing that you mentioned, which was about the lack of market access commitments in current US policy. And I want to relate that to the sort of relative gravitational pull of China versus the US, because obviously the willingness of other countries to sort of see the world in American terms and go along with its preferences on security-related trade issues is going to depend quite a bit on how connected they are to the US economy. And I wondered what your sense of the debate within policy circles in the US of, do they recognize a disjuncture between wanting the rest of the world to go along with you on this and either not opening up or not revitalizing the US economy to make its gravitational pull more significant?
Well, you said it better than I could. I think this is a very, very important issue. I think the answer is, unfortunately, no, they are not discussing this. This is exactly right. You want to convince people to do something which may have an economic cost for them, but frankly, you don't want to offer them something in exchange. Catherine Tai often says she is a negotiator. She wants to negotiate. What is she going to negotiate over? This is, I think, partly or largely a function of US politics right now. And all I can say is that our friends who are with us through the 4 years of the Trump administration, I hope they will abide with us a little bit longer. And hopefully, I'm not even sure what the outcome will be. We're going to have a very highly contested midterm elections. As you know, President Biden's approval rating has been sinking. Despite the fact that he's done many things in the first 9 months of his administration. It's a very, very tough political landscape here in the United States right now. And I think that given the key states that they need to keep in the next presidential election. They just don't see any room for market access. Now, maybe Ambassador Tai would say that's not true, but if she did, I'd like to see her talk about where and when. We didn't get that. I mean, I was at her speech, her main speech, which supposedly was on China, that was given at Center for Strategic and International Studies, I think about a month ago. And there was no mention of market opening at all. She's committed to the phase 1 deal with China. And I frankly, although we at the Peterson Institute were highly critical of what we saw as managed trade, and I personally was, at this point, it is an agreement, and the two sides need to see how it can be, if not completely met, and we know the Chinese are way behind in their purchases, it can be amended in a way that leads us toward some resolution of some of the tensions between the two. I think that's what she wants. I'm not sure it's what we're seeing. So unfortunately, I think right now the politics are such that the kinds of things that the US needs to give, and always led by giving it in the past, right now don't seem to be tenable, can't be given. So that is why I think you are finding that I'm a bit disappointed and perhaps pessimistic.
You mentioned the phase 1 agreement, which of course, as you said, is managed trade, and managed trade that if it had been implemented, or if it does get implemented, very much to the disadvantage of many of yours or China's trading partners around the world. And managed trade, of course, is the antithesis of the rules-based system that the US purports to evangelize, because it actually is what smaller countries are looking for in terms of trade rules, is to be protected against the kind of thing that China and the United States have engaged in. A specialist at the Council of Foreign Relations actually describing this quoted the Thucydides, not the Thucydides of the Thucydides trap, but another part of Thucydides, the strong do what they can and the weak suffer what they must. And we seem to be moving more and more into that kind of world at the moment. I noticed that there's also a trade deal apparently done between the US and the EU, which is also being described as managed trade. And you mentioned Catherine Tai. Well, I saw your colleague Gary Huffbauer the other day described Catherine's policies as Lighthizer policies with a smile. Is there any way forward out of this from the point of view of the rest of the world? Or is this just something we're going to have to put up with? Is it the case of the strong do what they can and the weak suffer what they must?
Well, this is about power, isn't it? You know, I have taught trade and trade theory and trade policy for 30 years here in the States. And, you know, one of the things we used to say about the system that the US had set up was that it was meant to in some sense, prevent the weaponization of trade, which only the powerful are able to do, right? And yet we see, yes, the same being done by the two largest economies in the world. So we're at a place where I, frankly, 10 years ago, never thought we would be, and probably you share that view, Rob. This is not the future that we imagined. But it is where we are, and I don't see us backing down from it anytime soon. I think that it could take the form of, you're with us or you're against us. That's the club version, right? And you asked, what can the rest of the world do? I think the rest of the world can think of ways to move around the US, and they have. The other TPP partners move forward with CPTPP. And CPTPP is becoming a major force to reckon with. Its importance to the global economy will only increase over time, I think. We see it in the applications of the UK to join, in China's application to join, and Taiwan's application to join. So that's one example. Another example is the form of dispute resolution, that a set of countries having, large set of countries have created at the WTO. So do-arounds, we see it in JSIs. So groups of countries who want to move forward on a particular issue, such as plastics, restraints on plastic pollution, or digital trade, but having it as an open club and therefore consistent with WTO rules. So I think these are ways in which, given what's happening with the largest economies, the rest of the world can move forward and say, we are going to continue to create a system. Now, obviously, that's disappointing. We all know that the gains from integration depend on the partners that join. And so, for example, when the US pulled out of CPTPP, this was disappointing to many of the partners who believed that their gains from joining would be diminished. But nevertheless, there are gains there to be had, and it is a way to move forward and to create a path where we hope the US will be able to catch up at some point.
Any more questions in the chat section? So if I may, abuse my position by asking you another question and moving across to your other specialty, which is China. One of the questions about China, which there's a lot of uncertainty about, is what is the path of economic reform in China, and what is the path indeed of trade policy in China? And President Xi made a speech to APEC last week in which he said that China is going to continue with economic reform. It is going to continue opening up its economy, which completely contradicts the narrative that comes out of sections of the United States, which is that China has completely turned away from economic reform, that it's closing its economy, that all the decisions are being made by Xi Jinping, everything's coming out of Xi Jinping's head. And of course, that's critical to the question of China joining the CPTPP, because China would have to accept, well, at least I hope they would have to accept that if they join the CPTPP, they would have to comply with those conditions, which would imply significant reform of their state-owned enterprise policies, among other things. Which would, by the way, be very good for China, I think, in terms of its own economic development. So given that we have these completely contrasting narratives about the trajectory of policy in China, where do you see things?
I think that China is continuing on the path of reform and that it has opened. Obviously, it has reduced barriers to entering financial services. It has reduced equity caps in many areas for foreign investors. It has established courts that deal with intellectual property violations. So there are very real accomplishments. At the same time, the state is exerting a much stronger hand throughout the economy. That is reflected in increased importance of adhering to central party diktats on a whole range of issues. These affect all Chinese firms, but also foreign firms that operate on China. They must respect Chinese law. So it extends to the arts, to people's leisure time. So the state has reasserted itself into many areas of life. At the same time, we also see a turning inward in China. So the Chinese people get less outside information than they had before. We have less contact with China. There's a heightened suspicion of foreign influence. There is more suspicion of people who have a great deal of contact with the West. So I think that we have both stepping on the gas and stepping on the brake at the same time. Now, what we can see is that for many investors, the stepping on the gas clearly dominates, since investment funds continue to flow into China and in fact are growing. So investors in that sense say, hey, we can live within these rules. Now, what does that mean for our exporters, though, from outside China? And I think that's where we have particular concern. Are our exports really getting a fair chance on Chinese markets? This is, again, back to the issue that Natasha raised about market access. Do we have clear market access into China? And I think for many countries, not just the United States, there's great concern about that, as well as about competition in our own markets from firms that many see as subsidized. So there are very real issues here that are consistent or just don't diminish the fact that China is continuing to open. So like all large, complicated societies, China is, it's a puzzle. It has, contains many different strands at the same time. How the US can navigate that, I think, is to try to recognize where progress is being made and try to be honest about areas in which it isn't. Unfortunately, here there is a fatigue, a sense that we tried to talk with China for 20 years and they weren't listening. And in fact, there were many op-eds today saying they're afraid that President Biden is going to fall in the same old path of others where, they're just going to talk with China and they're going to let the Chinese just pull a fast one over on us. That is definitely the types of criticism that President Biden will get as he begins to try to have a thaw in relations and begin to negotiate. So I think that that's misguided, that there are very real progress that China has made. There are also some worrying signs about the state control of the economy. I think mostly those will affect the Chinese growth rate and the Chinese people themselves, but also very real questions about market access and about fair competition. And those are something that we should be in negotiations with, though, in my view, with the Chinese.
I'll just ask my colleagues if they have any, Asher or Haiping, have you got any questions for Mary? I don't want to monopolize the question time.
Rob, may I ask a question for Mary? So given this is because in the morning we talk about digital economy, and this is clear that digital economy has taken momentum during the pandemic and would be also continue to grow in the post-pandemic recovery. And it is very clear that China has been doing a lot in promoting digital technology and promoting business through digital platform. And it's quite clear that Asia is one of the most developed, most active market for digital economy. So could you please share with us the view that in the US on the market growth in Asia in terms of digital economy, and what could be the potential competition between US and China in this particular marketplace?
Well, of course, we have to recognize that we have different approaches to the digital economy, right? A free and open internet versus a restricted internet space, right? Who gets to advertise and in what form in each market? These impact commerce in the two. So I think there are some very fundamental differences in the approaches to digital commerce. We can think, okay, there's a lot of differences between the US and China, each with its strengths and weaknesses in the approach to management of social media. Here where we let the companies police themselves, oftentimes not very well, whereas China censorship is broader. But I don't think it stops there with what we put on TikTok, even though I should say TikTok itself is digital commerce, right? It's not just about social media. It's about how companies market their products, contact their customers, either B2B or B2C. Obviously, where data is stored and how that data is handled. These are all very important issues and guardrails for businesses where the two systems highly diverge. So this is an area where I am, again, somewhat pessimistic that we can reach an agreement where we have a complete openness. The question is, can we reach some kind of interaction of two systems that promotes a limited type of integration? That may be possible, but it's going to require a willingness and even an enthusiasm on both sides to create those rules. And I see us only to be kind at the very beginning on that. A second, of course, is whether we'll have compatibility of the systems over the long term. We know that the United States would like to see a robust build out of a 5G system, which is not Chinese. The Chinese, of course, have had great success globally with telecoms. So I think that this is another area where we're not just talking about what gets transmitted over the wires, but who built those wires, who controls those wires. And this is probably the hardest part of the relationship that you've put your finger on. I think it's the part where we're going to have to find some way to coexist without complete integration. The hope would be that that doesn't then, spill over to trade and services, trade in non-technology related goods, of which there is a great deal of trade across Asia to the United States and other NAFTA countries. So I think you've really put your finger on the key issue, largely written digital trade and technology, and where we will, if we will be able to. And in my view, it doesn't look like we're headed toward a system that is anything but two systems that somehow we hope can interact in a way that makes commerce possible.
I don't like to finish on a pessimistic note, but it just occurs to me when we're having this discussion that from the point of view of the two protagonists, does anybody actually think about what the two countries, China and the United States, are actually losing themselves out of all this? I mean, there must be, the damage to both economies must be huge, and it doesn't seem to factor in to any discussions.
There was a question in the chat of whether President Biden has surrounded himself with advisors who take a more nuanced view, and I think he has. There is definitely much deeper discussion going on now, not only in the White House, but also in the think tanks, civil society written more broadly in the United States than there was during the Trump years, where there really wasn't any communication between what was happening there and many other parts of society. It was somewhat of a closed system. So in some sense, that gives me some hope that these realities are hitting home. To some extent, I think the national security concerns are dominating here. And as I mentioned earlier, the politics as well, which box it in. I think they are, however, very aware that without having a robust economic agenda for the Asia Pacific, the US will not be able to lead. They'll be able to continue strongly on military, but in terms of leading in other ways, I think it will take its toll over time. I think they are aware of that. I think that is very different than under the Trump administration, when you had advisors very close to President Trump, like Peter Navarro, who really just wanted to see a complete decoupling. And we're very divorced from reality, in my view. I'm sure if he thinks of me at all, he thinks I'm also pretty divorced from reality, but I think my reality is the right one. So I think we do have a big difference here now in this administration. And if they have enough time and enough play, enough political leeway, they can get it. The question, of course, is, will they? And that is something that we really won't know until our first indication will be the midterm elections next year.
Thank you. Well, I think perhaps that's a good note to end on, because you're holding out a little bit of hope, however slender, that things will improve, which I think we all devoutly wish for. I'd just like to conclude myself by saying thank you so much for taking the time, first of all, at a very late hour for yourself, but also for taking the time to provide what I'm sure all of us have found a fascinating presentation, maybe a bit of a wake-up call, maybe not particularly reassuring, but certainly a real from Washington, DC on where we are at now. And I guess that's a reality that we are all, I'm talking about the rest of the world, are going to have to adjust to. And so it's really, really helpful to have a as realistic and as frank in a discussion as this one has been. So thank you so much for that.
You're very welcome. And I hope our friends in the Asia Pacific know there are many of us that are working daily to try to improve relations. And, you know, we have hopes. So we continue the fight. So my pleasure to be with you.
Well, we'll be cheering you on.
Thank you.